Every small town has a place like it. A quiet spot, a local landmark, a place where teenagers dare each other to go after dark, and where fishermen tell tales of the one that got away. It's a place of peaceful reflection, a mirror for the sky. But what if that reflection is hiding an unfathomable darkness? What if the placid surface of the water is a lid, holding down a secret so vile it defies imagination? The story you are about to hear is about such a place, and the horrific truth it was forced to reveal. It is a tale of the girls nobody looked for, the monster nobody saw, and a pond that became a graveyard. Before we cast our line into these murky waters, if you are intrigued by mysteries that explore the chilling depths of human depravity, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You will not want to miss the secrets we are about to dredge up. Now, let us take you to the forgotten town of Blackwater Creek, and the place they called Miller's Pond. The heat of that August was a physical presence in Blackwater Creek. It was a merciless, suffocating blanket that bleached the sky to a hazy white and baked the very life out of the earth. Lawns crisp to the color of straw, the creek that gave the town its name dwindled to a muddy trickle, and for the first time in living memory, the water level of Miller's Pond began to recede. Miller's Pond was an institution, a deep, spring-fed body of water on the edge of town, named for the reclusive, grizzled old man who owned the surrounding land. It was a place of local legend, rumored to be bottomless, its depths holding colossal, prehistoric-looking catfish. For decades, it had been a place of quiet continuity. But as the relentless sun beat down, the pond began to give up its secrets, reluctantly, one cracked and muddy foot at a time. The shoreline, once soft and verdant, pulled back to reveal a ghostly, gray landscape of drying mud littered with the detritus of years. Rusted cans, a single child's boot, and the skeletal remains of a bicycle. It was a pair of birdwatchers who found the first real clue. They were looking for a rare egret said to be nesting in the exposed roots of a willow tree when they saw it. A tattered pink backpack, half sunk in the viscous, gray mud. It was the kind of thing a teenage girl would carry. Sticking out of the unzipped top was the corner of a waterlogged textbook and something else. A pale, slender object that, upon closer inspection, made them both recoil in horror. It was a bone, a human bone. Detective Jack Russo stood at the newly formed, foul-smelling shoreline, the stench of decay and stagnant water thick in his throat. The pink backpack sat on a sterile blue tarp, a grotesque splash of color in the monochrome landscape of mud and misery. Jack had returned to Blackwater Creek 5 years ago, a burned-out city detective seeking the quiet he remembered from his childhood. He had traded homicides for stolen garden gnomes and armed robberies for domestic disputes. Until today. "It's her, Jack," Sheriff Brody said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that did little to hide his unease. Brody was a man built for a quiet town, more comfortable organizing the annual Founders' Day parade than dealing with a potential murder scene. "The bag belongs to Ashley Peterson. Disappeared from the next county over about 6 months back. A runaway. Cops figured she'd hitched a ride to the coast." Jack crouched down, his gaze fixed on the slender forearm bone the medical examiner was now carefully bagging. Ashley Peterson. He remembered the flyer. A girl with sad eyes and a forced smile. One of a dozen such flyers that passed through his inbox every month. Ghosts on a screen. He had filed it away. Another lost girl in a world full of them. Now her story had ended here, in the mud of Miller's Pond. "And the pond's owner?" Jack asked, looking up the hill towards the dilapidated, solitary cabin where Old Man Miller lived. "Silas Miller," Brody sighed. "He's a nasty piece of work. Been a recluse since his wife died 20 years ago. Barely comes to town. Mostly just yells at kids who try to fish in his pond without permission. We're getting a warrant for the cabin now. He's the obvious place to start." As the forensics team began the slow, painstaking process of sectioning off and searching the exposed mudflats, Jack felt a cold, familiar dread creeping into his bones. It was a feeling he hadn't had since he'd left the city, a ghost from his own past. 20 years ago, his own sister, Sarah, had vanished from Blackwater Creek. She was 17, a little wild, and had threatened to run away a dozen times. The town had searched for a week, and then, slowly, they had stopped. She became another sad story, a cautionary tale whispered by parents to their rebellious daughters. Her case had never been solved. It was the reason he had become a cop, and the reason he had fled the city. The ghosts of the lost girls were his ghosts. The search of the mudflats yielded more horrors. A single, mud-caked sneaker, a tarnished silver locket, and then another bone, and another. The medical examiner, a grim-faced woman named Dr. Anya Sharma, confirmed they were from at least 2 different individuals. The town's quiet pond was a graveyard. The decision was made to bring in pumps and drain the entire thing. It was a massive undertaking, an act that felt like a violation of nature, a desecration. But what lay beneath the surface was a desecration of a far more terrible kind. Over the next 2 days, as the pumps chugged and groaned, the water level dropped, and the true, breathtaking scale of the nightmare was revealed. The bottom of Miller's Pond was a carpet of bones, a chaotic, tangled mess of human remains, interspersed with rocks, sunken logs, and the eerie, skeletal shapes of more bicycles and even a rusted-out shopping cart. It was a watery tomb, a slaughterhouse boneyard. The forensic anthropology team that was called in from the state capitol worked for days, their white-suited figures moving like astronauts on a dead planet. The initial estimate was horrifying. 6 bodies, all female, all young. The bones bore telltale marks, not just of dismemberment, but of gnawing. "It's the fish, Jack," Dr. Sharma told him, her voice a strained whisper as they stood by the edge of the now empty, stinking chasm. "The bones have been picked clean, viciously. Look at the marks on this femur. They're like saw blades. Whatever Silas Miller has living in this pond, they're not your average catfish." The focus of the investigation intensified on the man who lived beside the tomb. Jack and Brody served the warrant on Silas Miller's cabin. The place was a hoarder's nightmare, a dusty, cobwebbed maze of junk, old newspapers, and the lingering smell of sour whiskey. Miller himself was a cliché of a backwoods hermit. Long, greasy gray hair, a tangled beard, and wild, paranoid eyes that darted around as if seeing things they weren't. He denied everything, his voice a rusty croak of rage and fear. "I ain't done nothin'," he spat, his breath foul. "They were trespassers, always sneaking around. The pond protects itself. That's all. It protects itself." His rambling denials did little to help his case. In a grimy, padlocked shed behind his cabin, they found a collection of disturbing items. A small pile of girls' clothing, a box of cheap jewelry, and a collection of driver's licenses, all belonging to young women who had been reported missing from the surrounding counties over the past 5 years. It was a killer's trophy box. For Sheriff Brody and the rest of the department, the case was open and shut. They had their monster, but for Jack it felt too easy, too perfect. The trophies were too obvious, displayed almost as if they were meant to be found. And Miller's words echoed in his head. "The pond protects itself." It sounded like the ramblings of a madman, but there was a strange conviction in his voice, as if he truly believed it. On the 3rd day of the investigation, as the last of the water was being pumped out, they found the heart of the pond's darkness. At the very bottom, in the deepest part of the basin, was a dense, writhing mass of fish. They were unlike anything Jack had ever seen. They were a species of pike, but they were monstrously large, some over 6 feet long, with dull, black eyes and mouths filled with rows of needle-sharp, serrated teeth. As the last of the water drained away, they thrashed in the mud, their powerful bodies coiling and snapping, their jaws gaping. They were the pond's secret keepers, its cleanup crew, the living weapons that had been used to erase 6 young women from the world. The town of Blackwater Creek was reeling, plunged into a state of shock and horror. The place of their childhood memories, of lazy summer afternoons and first kisses, had been a monster's pantry. And the monster, they believed, was the crazy old man who lived on the hill. The case was all but closed. The media had their villain, the police had their man, and the town had its scapegoat. But Jack Russo couldn't shake the feeling that they were all wrong. He stood at the edge of the empty pond, a vast, open wound in the earth, and stared at the writhing, predatory fish. He thought of his sister, Sarah, and the cold, empty space her disappearance had left in his life. He had spent his entire career looking for answers, and now, in the stinking pit of mud and bones, he felt he was closer than ever. But the answer, he suspected, was not in Silas Miller's dusty, cluttered cabin. The real monster, the architect of this horror, was still out there. And the pond, even now that it was empty, had not yet given up all its secrets. With Silas Miller in custody, a collective, premature sigh of relief settled over Blackwater Creek. The monster had a facie haggard, wild-eyed face that fit neatly into their preconceived notions of what evil looked like. The news crews that had descended upon the town broadcast Miller's image alongside the horrific details emerging from the pond, creating a simple, digestible narrative. A monstrous recluse had been preying on vulnerable girls for years, using his private pond and its terrifying inhabitants as his personal disposal system. The case, as far as the public and Sheriff Brody were concerned, was closed. All that remained was the grim, lengthy process of identifying the victims and hoping for a confession. Miller, however, was not confessing. He sat in his cell, a cornered, terrified animal, alternating between bouts of rage-filled, incoherent shouting about trespassers and long periods of catatonic silence. He would only repeat his mantra, over and over, his voice a low, desperate chant. The pond protects itself. The hunger must be fed. To the interrogators, it was the rambling of a guilty, broken mind. Jack Russo, however, heard something else. He heard the words of a man who was a participant, perhaps even a guardian, but not the architect. The meticulous, patient evil required to carry out 6 murders over 5 years didn't align with the chaotic, paranoid energy of Silas Miller. Miller was a man of blunt force and simple rage. This killer was a craftsman. The focus of the investigation shifted to the grim task of putting names to the bones. The forensic anthropology team worked tirelessly, reassembling the skeletal remains in the sterile, silent environment of a temporary morgue set up at the town hall. Slowly, the victims began to regain their identities. Ashley Peterson, the runaway, was confirmed. Then came Jessica Thorne, a transient who had drifted through the area 2 years ago. Then 2 more, both identified from dental records, both girls with histories of trouble and broken homes, girls from the margins, girls who wouldn't be missed immediately. The pattern was clear and heartbreaking. The killer had chosen his victims with care, selecting those who were already practically invisible. As the investigation delved into the how, the unique and horrifying nature of the fish became a central question. Where had they come from? What were they? Sheriff Brody, eager to add another nail to Miller's coffin, tasked Jack with finding the answers. "Find the bill of sale for those goddamn piranhas, Russo," he'd grumbled. "Prove he brought them here for exactly this purpose." This line of inquiry led Jack to the one man in the region who might know, Dr. Alistair Finch. Finch was a respected ichthyologist and aquatic biologist, a professor at the State University 100 miles away, who also owned a private consultancy firm that specialized in exotic aquatic species and lake management. He was, in short, the perfect expert witness. When Jack called him, Finch was the epitome of professional concern and intellectual curiosity. "It's an absolute tragedy, detective," he said, his voice a smooth, educated baritone. "But from a biological standpoint, it's a fascinating, albeit gruesome, puzzle. I'd be more than happy to come down and offer any assistance I can." Dr. Finch arrived the next day. He was a man in his late 40s, tall and distinguished, with silvering hair at his temples and the kind of easy, academic charm that immediately put people at ease. He was dressed in practical but expensive outdoor gear, and he exuded an air of calm, authoritative competence. He was a stark contrast to the grimy, chaotic horror of the empty pond. He examined the fish, which had been captured and placed in large holding tanks, with a scientist's detached fascination. "Remarkable," he murmured, peering through the glass. "They're a variation of Esox maskinongi, the muskellunge or muskie, but they're not native to this region, and they've been enhanced, selectively bred for size and aggression. Look at the dental structure. It's unusually serrated. They're hypercarnivores. In a contained ecosystem like this pond, with a limited food source, they would be perpetually ravenously hungry. He was brilliant, his explanations clear and concise. He provided the scientific validation for the horror. He theorized that the killer had starved the fish periodically to make them more efficient at their gruesome task. He was, in every way, the helpful expert, and his testimony would be devastating for Silas Miller. Finch spent several days in Blackwater Creek, assisting the investigation. He and Jack developed a professional rapport. They would talk for hours at the edge of the empty pond, Finch explaining the cold, brutal logic of a predator-prey ecosystem, Jack listening, absorbing the information, but still feeling that persistent, nagging doubt. So a man like Miller, Jack posited one afternoon, could he have engineered this? This specific breed of fish? Finch considered it, his brow furrowed in thought. It's possible, but highly unlikely. This isn't something an amateur could do. This requires a significant understanding of genetics of aquaculture. You'd need specialized facilities. Your Mr. Miller doesn't strike me as the type. But he could have bought them? Jack pressed. Certainly, Finch agreed. There are black markets for exotic species. It would be difficult to trace, but for the right price you can acquire almost anything. And for a man looking for a disposal method, these creatures would be frighteningly perfect. They are nature's ultimate secret keepers. Finch's insights were invaluable. He helped them trace the probable origin of the species to a handful of illicit breeders in Eastern Europe. He also provided a detailed report on the fish's feeding habits, which corresponded perfectly with the medical examiner's findings on the bones. He was building their case against Miller piece by meticulous piece. He was the perfect witness. But during one of their conversations, Finch said something that snagged in Jack's mind. They were discussing the killer's psychology. You see, detective, Finch had said, gesturing towards the pond, the killer isn't just disposing of bodies. This is a statement. He sees his victims as a kind of pollution, a blight on the natural order. And he is using the purest form of Naturia Predator to cleanse the world of them. He feeds the impurity to the pure. It's a kind of ritual, a baptism in reverse. The explanation was chillingly articulate, insightful to the point of being almost empathetic. It sounded less like a criminal profiler's theory and more like a philosopher's manifesto. At the time, Jack had been impressed by Finch's intellectual grasp of the situation. But later, the words would come back to haunt him. The evidence against Miller continued to mount. The forensics team found traces of the victim's DNA in his cabin, on the very clothes they had found in the shed. The driver's licenses were a damning collection of trophies. The case was solid. Sheriff Brody scheduled a press conference to announce the charges. The town and the state could finally close the book on the Miller's Pond murders. Jack, however, felt more disconnected from the official narrative than ever. He couldn't shake the image of Miller, the raving, terrified old man, and reconcile it with the cold, patient, and intellectually sophisticated killer Finch had described. And there was another, deeper reason for his doubt. In the box of trophies found in Miller's shed, there was nothing belonging to his sister, Sarah. If Miller had been killing for 2 decades, as his age and proximity would suggest, why was Sarah, a girl who had disappeared from the very same town, not among his victims? It was a hole in the story, a personal, aching void that kept Jack from accepting the simple, easy answer. On the night before the press conference, Jack was reviewing the case files in his office, the glow of his computer screen the only light in the quiet station. He was looking at the timeline of the disappearances. The 6 girls from the pond had all vanished within the last 5 years. There was a long 15-year gap between their disappearances and that of his sister. It was possible there were 2 separate monsters, 2 unconnected stories. But Jack's gut told him otherwise. On a hunch, he ran a deep background check on Dr. Alistair Finch. The man's record was impeccable. A celebrated academic, a respected consultant. But Jack found one small, interesting detail. 20 years ago, just before he had become a renowned professor, Finch had been a young, unknown graduate student. And for his doctoral thesis, he had been conducting field research on non-native predatory fish species. His primary research site, for a period of 2 years, had been a series of remote lakes and ponds in the rural county that included one small, forgotten town, Blackwater Creek. The helpful expert hadn't just come to town to help them. He had been there before. He had been there when Sarah disappeared. The doubt in Jack's mind solidified into a cold, hard suspicion. The timeline fit. The expertise fit. The chillingly insightful psychological profile fit. Jack looked at the picture of the handsome, smiling doctor on his screen and felt a profound, sickening chill. He had been talking to the monster for days, shaking his hand, listening to his theories. And the monster had been patiently, brilliantly, helping them convict the wrong man. The press conference was a circus. Sheriff Brody stood at the podium, his chest puffed out, basking in the flashbulbs of the cameras. He laid out the case against Silas Miller in clear, concise terms. The trophies, the DNA evidence, the monstrous fish. He was the hero who had captured the monster of Blackwater Creek. The town was safe again. The case was, for all intents and purposes, closed. Jack stood at the back of the room, a silent, unwilling participant. He watched Brody perform and felt a growing sense of nausea. Every piece of evidence they had was solid, but it felt curated. It was a perfect, ready-made narrative, and Dr. Finch had been their helpful narrator every step of the way. Jack's discovery that Finch had been in Blackwater Creek 20 years ago had transformed his vague suspicion into a consuming obsession. He now looked at the entire case through a new lens, and everything was distorted. After the press conference, Jack went to the county jail to see Miller. The old man was a wreck, his eyes hollowed out, his body trembling. He was being held in isolation, and the solitude had clearly taken its toll. "They're gonna kill me?" Miller rasped, his fingers clutching the bars of his cell. "They're saying I did it. I didn't. I just fed the hunger." "Whose hunger, Silas?" Jack asked, his voice low and calm. "Tell me about the hunger." Miller's eyes darted around the empty hallway. "The pond's hunger," he whispered, leaning closer. "It's been hungry for a long time, ever since he came. The fish man." Jack's blood ran cold. "The fish man? Who's that?" "Came here years ago," Miller said, his voice a conspiratorial hiss. "A young fella then. Smart. Talked about balance. About nature. Said the pond was sick. Needed cleaning. He brought the fish. Just little ones at first. Said they were special. Said they would keep the pond pure. And he told me how to care for them. What to feed them. What did he tell you to feed them? Beavers? Muskrats? Anything that didn't belong," Miller said. "And then, later, he started bringing other things. Packages. Wrapped in plastic. Said it was waste. Impurities. Said the pond would take care of it. He paid me to look the other way. Paid me to feed the hunger. That's all I did. I just fed them. He was the one who decided what was impure. It was the missing piece. Miller was not the killer. He was the groundskeeper, the caretaker of the tomb, a paid accomplice who was likely too scared or too dim-witted to understand the full scope of the horror he was facilitating. And the fish man, the young, smart fella who talked about balance and purity. It had to be Finch. "This man," Jack said, his voice tight. "Did you ever see him with anyone? A girl, maybe? 20 years ago? A teenage girl with dark hair?" Miller's eyes went wide with a flicker of ancient memory. "The first one," he whispered, his body starting to shake violently. "She was the first. Impurity. He said she was sick. A blight. He said the pond would make her clean. He told me the hunger was awake now, and it would need to be fed. Always. Sarah, his sister. The first victim. The prototype." The rage that surged through Jack was so hot and so powerful it almost blinded him. This wasn't just a case anymore. This was a vendetta. But he had no proof. Miller's testimony was the rambling of a man who would be considered an insane, unreliable witness. The DNA and the trophies in Miller's shed were still irrefutable. Jack realized with a sickening clarity that Finch had not only used Miller as his caretaker, but he had also meticulously set him up to be the perfect scapegoat. He had likely planted the evidence in the shed himself, a final, brilliant move to ensure the story would end with the crazy old recluse. Jack spent the next 2 days in a frantic, secret race against time. He knew that, with the case closed, Finch would feel safe. But he also knew that a man like Finch, a man with such a profound and arrogant God complex, would have a weakness. He would have kept records. He would have a sanctuary, a place where he documented his life's work. Ignoring Brody's direct orders to focus on the final case report, Jack drove the 100 miles to the university campus where Finch worked. He spent a day observing, learning Finch's routine. The professor was a creature of habit, moving with an unhurried, confident air between his lecture hall, his pristine office, and the university's vast aquatic research laboratory. He was basking in the glow of his newfound status as the expert who had helped crack the state's most gruesome murder case. Jack knew he couldn't get a warrant to search Finch's property based on the ravings of Silas Miller. He would have to cross the line. That night, dressed in black, he broke into Finch's university office. The office was as neat and ordered as the man himself. Books on genetics and evolutionary biology lined the walls. There was nothing out of place, nothing to suggest the monster that lurked beneath the academic veneer. But in a locked drawer of his desk, Jack found a small, leather-bound journal. The journal was not a confession. It was a philosophical treatise. In dense, elegant prose, Finch laid out his horrific worldview. He wrote of humanity as a plague species, of society as a polluted ecosystem. He wrote of his self-appointed role as a purifier, a naturalist, who was simply accelerating the process of natural selection. He identified certain individuals' transients, runaways, prostitutes as social detritus, and described his method as a form of ecological recycling. "I do not destroy," he wrote. "I transmute. I take the waste of a failed society and use it to feed a purer, more perfect form of life. I turn filth into elegant predators. It is the most beautiful, most logical form of alchemy." The journal was the key, the Rosetta Stone to his madness. But it wasn't proof. It was the diary of a man with a disturbing philosophy, but it didn't explicitly link him to the girls in the pond. Jack photographed every page with his phone. He needed more. He then went to the aquatic research lab, a vast, humid building filled with rows upon rows of massive fish tanks. Using a key he had borrowed from Finch's office, he let himself in. Most of the tanks were labeled with scientific names. But in a small, private section at the back of the lab, a section hidden behind a partition, he found something else. There were 7 tanks. 6 were labeled with a simple code, AP, JT, and so on, the initials of the 6 victims from the pond. Inside each tank was a single, monstrous pike, identical to the ones from Miller's pond. They were his specimens, his trophies. The 7th tank was empty. On it was a small, new label with a single handwritten initial S. Sarah. This was it. This was the proof. This was the monster sanctuary, his private museum of murder. As Jack stood there, the only sound the hum of the filters and the occasional thump of a fish against the glass. His phone buzzed. It was Sheriff Brody. "Jack, you better get back here now." Brody's voice was strained, urgent. "Silas Miller. He's dead. Hanged himself in his cell an hour ago." Jack's blood ran cold. "He left a note," Brody continued. 3 words. "The hunger is quiet." It was Finch. It had to be. He had tied up the final loose end. With Miller's confession and suicide, the case was now hermetically sealed. Finch was untouchable. Jack stared at the empty tank, the one marked with his sister's initial, and knew that his secret, unsanctioned investigation had just become a desperate, one-man war against a killer who had achieved the perfect crime. Silas Miller's suicide was the final, brutal punctuation mark on the official story. To the world, it was a confession, the last act of a guilty man who couldn't live with his crimes. The note, "The hunger is quiet," was interpreted as a killer's cryptic sign-off. The case was closed. The files were stamped. The news crews packed up, and Blackwater Creek was left to grapple with its new, dark identity. For Jack Russo, however, Miller's death was a declaration of war. He knew it wasn't a suicide. Finch had gotten to him. Whether through a proxy, a threat, or some form of psychological manipulation, Finch had silenced his only witness. Jack was now completely alone, armed with a terrifying truth that no one would believe. He had photographs of a madman's philosophical journal and a secret fish tank, evidence gathered illegally, evidence that would be dismissed as the obsessive fantasy of a grieving brother. The weight of it all was crushing. The official channels were closed to him. Sheriff Brody, relieved to have the case neatly tied up, had warned Jack to let it go. "It's over, son," he'd said, his tone one of weary finality. "Let the man be judged by his maker. This town needs to heal." But Jack knew the sickness was still out there, walking around in the guise of a respected academic. He became a ghost, taking a leave of absence from the department, citing stress and personal time. His life contracted, shrinking down to a single burning purpose: to find the one piece of irrefutable evidence that would link Alistair Finch to the murders and, most importantly, to the disappearance of his sister, Sarah. He started with the journal. Finch's philosophy, his alchemy, was the key. A man this meticulous, this arrogant, wouldn't just kill. He would study. He would document. The fish in the lab were his living trophies, but there had to be more. There had to be a ledger, a record of his transmutations. Jack's investigation turned him into a mirror image of the man he was hunting. Obsessive, secretive, and operating outside the law. He used his old city contacts to run a deep financial background check on Finch. On the surface, it was clean, but Jack found a series of regular, high-value payments made from an offshore account to a chemical supply company. The company specialized in providing untraceable compounds, things that wouldn't show up in a standard toxicology report. It was the kind of place you went to if you wanted to sedate someone without leaving a mark. He also delved into Finch's academic past, going beyond his official publications. He found Finch's doctoral thesis, the one he had been researching in Blackwater Creek 20 years ago. It was a dense, brilliant paper on bioaccumulation, the process by which toxins concentrate in predators at the top of a food chain. In one chilling footnote, Finch mused about the theoretical possibility of an ecosystem being used as a biological incinerator, capable of breaking down and absorbing foreign matter, leaving no trace. He had written the blueprint for his life's work when he was just a graduate student. The real breakthrough came from a place of profound risk. Jack knew that Finch's weakness was his ego, his need to be near his creations. He gambled that Finch would have a private space, a place separate from the university, where he could truly indulge his obsession. Couldn't be his home. That was too conventional, too exposed. It had to be a place of science and solitude. Following a hunch, Jack started looking into properties Finch owned. He found one. A small, isolated piece of land about 30 miles from Blackwater Creek. It was listed as a private research outpost. The property contained a small, windowless concrete building and a deep, artesian well. It was the perfect place to hide a secret. One moonless night, Jack drove out to the property. It was as remote and desolate as he had imagined. The concrete building was secured with a high-tech electronic lock. It took him 2 hours, using skills he hadn't employed since his undercover days, to bypass the system. The inside of the building was a sterile, stainless steel nightmare. It was a laboratory far more advanced than the one at the university. This was Finch's real sanctuary. On one side of the room were a series of freezers. On the other, a dissection table and a complex array of chemical analysis equipment. With a growing sense of dread, Jack opened the first freezer. It was filled with carefully labeled biological samples. But these were not fish. They were human. Tissue samples, hair follicles, blood vials. Each was labeled with a simple, chilling code. He recognized the initials of the 6 girls from the pond. Finch hadn't just fed them to the fish. He had cataloged them first, like a biologist collecting specimens of an inferior species. In a separate, smaller freezer, locked with a keypad, he found what he was looking for. There was only one set of samples inside. They were older, the labels slightly faded. The code was simple, Specimen 0. Jack's hands trembled as he took one of the vials. He knew, with a gut-wrenching certainty, what he would find. He took the sample, along with a few others from the pond victims, and left, wiping every trace of his presence. The next day, he drove to the state capitol and called in the biggest favor of his life. He went to a friend, a DNA analyst at the state crime lab, a woman who owed him for saving her brother from a wrongful conviction years ago. "I can't tell you where I got these," he said, placing the samples on her desk. "And you can never tell anyone you did this for me. I need you to run a DNA comparison. Compare this one," he said, holding up the vial from Specimen 0, "to my own." She looked at him, her eyes full of questions he couldn't answer. But she saw the desperation, the raw 20-year-old pain in his face, and she nodded. "It will take 24 hours, she said. It was the longest day of Jack's life. He checked into a motel, the evidence now a ticking time bomb in his possession. He had what he needed. The samples were the irrefutable link. They proved Finch's connection to the victims in a way no one could deny. But it was the result of the final test that he both craved and dreaded. The call came the next afternoon. His friend's voice was soft, full of a sad, clinical pity. "It's a familial match, Jack," she said. "A near-certain sibling relationship. The sample from Specimen 0. It was your sister." The confirmation was not a relief. It was an agony. The 20-year-old mystery was solved, and the truth was a horror beyond anything he could have imagined. Sarah had not just been murdered. She had been collected. She was the first experiment, the genesis of the monster's life's work. But as the grief and rage washed over him, it was replaced by a cold, diamond-hard clarity. He now had the alchemist's ledger, the undeniable proof of his crimes. But he knew that just turning it over to the police wasn't enough. A man like Finch would have lawyers, he would create doubt, he would turn the trial into a circus, and Jack's illegal search would be the centerpiece. Justice in a courtroom felt too clean, too sterile for a monster like Alistair Finch. He thought of the pond. He thought of the hunger. He thought of Finch's own philosophy: transmutation, purification, the turning of filth into predators. A new, terrible idea began to form in his mind. He would not just bring Finch to justice. He would bring him to the altar of his own dark religion. He would make the alchemist the final ingredient in his own horrific creation. The final act was not about justice. It was about balance. It was about a reckoning, conducted not according to the laws of man, but according to the brutal, elegant laws of the monster himself. Jack Russo, armed with the horrifying confirmation of his sister's fate, was no longer a detective. He was an instrument of a very specific, very personal vengeance. He knew he couldn't confront Finch directly. The man was too clever, too cautious. He had to be lured, drawn back to the scene of his greatest triumph, the place where his philosophy had been put into practice: Blackwater Creek. Jack's plan was a dangerous piece of psychological theater. He began to leak information, small, anonymous tips to a hungry online true crime community that was still obsessed with the Miller's Pond murders. He leaked pages from Finch's philosophical journal, presenting them as the lost manifesto of Silas Miller. He created a narrative that Miller was not a simple madman, but the leader of a small, nature-worshipping cult. He then anonymously tipped off a local news station that a major new discovery was about to be made at the pond. The bait worked perfectly. The media frenzy reignited. The idea of a cannibal cult was far more compelling than a lone killer. Finch, watching from a distance, would see his life's work, his perfect secret philosophy, being attributed to a dead, ignorant fool. His ego, his intellectual pride, would not allow it. He would be compelled to return, to observe, perhaps even to subtly correct the narrative and reclaim his masterpiece. Jack also knew that the pond, which had been a dry, open wound for weeks, was now slowly refilling with the late autumn rains. And he knew something else. The authorities had removed most of the monstrous pike, but it was impossible to get them all. The smaller ones, and the thousands of eggs they had laid would remain. The hunger was not gone. It was just dormant, waiting. On a cold, moonless night, a week after he had started the media firestorm, Jack got the alert he was waiting for. A silent alarm he had placed on the access road to Miller's property had been tripped. He was coming. Jack was waiting, hidden in the dense woods overlooking the now partially refilled pond. The water was a black, glassy sheet under the starless sky. He watched as a single car approached, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Dr. Alistair Finch got out of the car. He was alone. He walked to the edge of the water, a dark silhouette against the faint moonlight. He stood there for a long time, the arrogant artist surveying his canvas. Jack stepped out of the woods, a heavy-duty tranquilizer rifle in his hands. It was a weapon used for tagging large animals, one he had acquired from a veterinarian friend under a false pretense. "Hello, Doctor." Jack's voice cut through the silence. Finch spun around, his face a mask of shock, but it was quickly replaced by a look of cold, intellectual appraisal. He showed no fear. "Detective Russo," he said, his voice as calm and smooth as ever. "I should have known. The crude narrative in the media, the talk of cults. It lacked my intellectual rigor. It was your work, wasn't it? An attempt to draw me out. Very clever." "It's over, Finch," Jack said, the rifle steady in his hands. "I know everything. Sarah, specimen 0. I have the samples from your lab." For the first time, a flicker of genuine surprise crossed Finch's face. He had underestimated the detective. He had underestimated the brother. "Ah," he said softly, a faint, almost admiring smile on his lips. "So you understand. Then you must understand that what I did was not murder. It was an honor. Your sister was the genesis. A troubled, impure girl, destined for a meaningless life. I gave her a purpose. I gave her a form of immortality. Her essence was the catalyst for my entire life's work. She was the first to be made clean, the first to feed the hunger. You should be grateful." The calm, rational monstrosity of his words was the final trigger. The 20 years of grief, of anger, of not knowing, coalesced into a single pure moment of white-hot rage. Jack fired the rifle. The tranquilizer dart hit Finch squarely in the chest. His eyes widened in shock, and then, as the powerful sedative hit his system, his legs buckled, and he collapsed to the ground. Jack worked quickly. He dragged Finch's unconscious body to the edge of the pond. He used a sharp knife to make a series of deep, bleeding cuts on Finch's arms and legs. He was not just killing a man. He was ringing the dinner bell. He then rolled Finch's body into the shallow, icy water. The blood began to cloud around him, a dark stain spreading across the black surface. Jack retreated back into the woods and waited. For a few minutes, there was only silence. Then the surface of the water began to stir. A ripple, then another. A dark, sleek shape moved beneath the surface. Then another, larger this time. The children of the original monsters, born in the mud and bones, were waking up. They had been dormant, but the scent of blood, the scent of their intended food source, had called to them. Finch began to stir, the cold water shocking his system. He groaned, his eyes fluttering open. He was groggy, disoriented, but conscious enough to understand where he was. He saw the dark shapes circling in the water around him. His academic curiosity was replaced by a raw, primal terror. The first of the pike struck, its needle-like teeth tearing at his leg. He screamed, a high, piercing sound that was abruptly cut off as another fish latched onto his arm. He thrashed, the water around him turning into a churning, crimson foam. He was the alchemist, the purifier, the man who saw himself as a god of his own ecosystem. And now, he was being consumed by his own creation, his impurities being fed back into the system. It was a perfect, horrifying symmetry. It was his own philosophy made real. Jack did not stay to watch the end. He turned and walked away, the sounds of the feeding frenzy, the screams of the monster, echoing behind him. He did not feel triumph. He did not feel relief. He felt only a vast, profound emptiness. The hunger of the pond had been fed one last time. The next day, Jack Russo walked into Sheriff Brody's office and placed a single, sealed evidence bag on his desk. Inside were the DNA samples from Finch's lab and a full, written confession of his own actions from the night before. The case of Dr. Alistair Finch became the stuff of legend, a story of a brilliant monster who met a poetic and terrible end. The official report stated that he had returned to the scene of his crimes, tormented by guilt, and had taken his own life by walking into the pond. Jack Russo's involvement was officially buried, his confession a secret kept between him and a shaken, complicit sheriff. Jack resigned from the force. He could no longer be a part of a system whose laws felt so inadequate to address the true nature of evil. He left Blackwater Creek and never returned. The town slowly healed, but the pond remained, a beautiful, tranquil scar on the landscape. The locals said that sometimes, on a quiet night, you could still feel a strange, insatiable hunger radiating from its dark, placid waters. The secrets were buried again, but the pond, and the things that lived within it, would never forget.